Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Gameweek 20 team selection. We have made a transfer already, so we mentioned that within the transfer plans video, but I thought it'd be good to recap Gameweek 19, sort of explain the team, why I made that decision, and what I think about transfers going forwards related to the transfer plans, but more specifically within the individual players and how I feel about them. So I think if you watch the transfer plans video, this is a segment that's quite similar. We ended up getting 70 points. That sent us back to 99,000 in the world. We did go with Palmer captaincy. That was sort of a decision I arrived on in the last 2 days, I believe, of the deadline. I was obviously celebrating with family as well, away from the computer and all that, so I couldn't really make a video on that because I was in Edinburgh. But I did think that I wanted to sort of get that sort of free risk with Palmer. And honestly, yes, the joke is that it's not free risk because I've lost 14 points, but those decisions I don't mind, because I remember even earlier down the season, I had the chance to maybe go for a Saka captaincy versus both Leicester and Southampton. I didn't take those chances, and I was actually quite upset with myself that I didn't do so because of just fear of a player performing. Like at the time, Haaland was performing madly. Right now, Salah's performing madly, and he's continued to do so. But I'd also say the context is that Palmer, despite the sort of amazing season that Salah's done, Palmer has played a great season, right? On underlyings and honestly, and even on actual performance, he's been the second best player by far as well. So really impressive season. I don't really regret the decision to go against Ipswich away. Did I think Ipswich would get their first win of the season at home versus Chelsea? No, but they did. And that happens, and you just move on from time to time like that. Flecken, nice to see that he's back. It just means that I get him for Southampton. For Gabriel, I think one of the big questions to ask is, now that I've got such a strong defense, if I have faith in Castagna keeping his spot, maybe I actually, persist with Castagna, Hall, Munoz, and I don't really need, arguably, 5 such elite defenders, and maybe I can actually trust in the value of how good Munoz is, how good Hall is, as a bit more of a permanent play option, right? Not every week sort of benching 2 really good fullbacks. And then in the midfield position, the biggest question mark is probably going to be on Odegaard, right? Blanked the last 2 weeks. Good chance for Ipswich, nothing really versus Brentford, but still someone who is involved within aspects of open play and lost corners to Notary, which I think is significant, but then is still the penalty taker of the team. And I still think that I'm going to give him these 2 next fixtures. It's going to be Brighton and Tottenham, and we'll see what to do after that. Because I do think, yes, Gordon's interesting. Yes, Bruno's interesting even, if he comes back and he can salvage this team and they can play with Ugarte as well in the midfield. But Mbeumo also looks fantastic. And questions I suppose to be asked as to, do I sell Rodgers? Do I sell Mbeumo? Do I sell Odegaard? So all these kind of questions in my mind. And then Cunha, who I have already made a transfer for towards Wood. Yes, Jesus looked brilliant versus Brentford, but I also think if you actually look at the chances, one was sort of a kind of really good poacher's chance, I would say, getting a tap in there. The assist was just a shot on target, really rebound type of thing. I'm not super enthused with the idea of, let's say, either going Jesus or Wood. I think Wood provides a lot of value, and I think Jesus' minutes, as we can see within some of the matches when they have a bit more depth available, Jesus can be 70 minutes per game. He could be 90 minutes per game as well, whereas Wood gives me that sort of consistency and penalties. And so I'm happy if I make a decision to go with Wood permanently going forwards, and I've already made that decision. As far as Isak and João Pedro, yeah, I mean, these players are probably going to be staying in my team for the foreseeable, because I think João Pedro is still realistically at that sort of 5.x price point, the best striker in the game. And then Isak is just Isak. And that's really it with the team. That was the review for Game Week 19. And we can now move on towards the Game Week 20 team selection. As ever, we get to use Rob T and his fantastic sort of visuals using the sort of market odds as well. Sometimes we use 11FI, which, I mean, he's outperformed market this season, so maybe we should stick to 11FI as well. But the projections this week will be coming from Rob T, and the projections are actually quite interesting, right? Very, very good game for Man City from the offensive point of view. Good for Villa, good for Leicester, and not Leicester, sorry, but Liverpool. Unfortunately, we were, suspended from being able to invest into this Aston Villa fixture through Rodgers, so that's really tough. But it's once again another great game for Watkins. So anyone who made that punt 2 weeks ago probably is going to be really enjoying themselves, or rather 1 week ago, especially after the Duran suspension. As far as Fulham versus Ipswich, this is an interesting fixture where I would say, quite surprisingly, the Fulham almost goal expectation is rather low, considering it's such a good fixture. It's a home fixture as well. It kind of also signals to me that maybe Fulham, as we've been saying within the series, they're not one of the more electric sort of top heavy offenses, right? Their value as a team is mostly coming from their defense, and it's been really respectable. But you've still seen Jimenez score, you've still seen Muniz score recently. It's still a great game for those sorts of players. But maybe the midfield is where I'd say maybe it still lacks a bit of value within Fulham, particularly if you can't guarantee the minutes of certain players like a Smith Rowe. Elsewhere, I would say Chelsea have a reasonably tough game considering it's an away game versus Palace. Bournemouth with a good game versus Everton. Simply put, anytime you get to face off Everton now, it seems like a guaranteed clean sheet unless you're Rico Lewis and you're Man City. But Tottenham and Newcastle seems like a classic both teams to score type of game. Brighton versus Arsenal, pretty, I would say, low clean sheet odds for Arsenal considering how stellar their defense have been recently, right? When you're looking at some of the recent expected goals conceded per game for Arsenal, it's incredibly low, 0.x every game. And that's just so impressive. But still, the markets are paying respect to Brighton and Brighton being at home as well. And in the Liverpool versus Man United game, that is now almost the golden goose of this game week, right? With Man United looking so poor recently, Liverpool continuing to look absolutely exceptional. That looks like a great game with much better clean sheet odds as well compared to City. And I think that the point is to say that the markets have definitely reacted to a couple trends this season, right? Bournemouth being a good team, City being much worse, particularly on defense. And then obviously a couple teams showing up as really strong teams, like a Fulham, for example, this season. And even Wolves, for example, I think getting some of their due respects for a game like this, despite Nottingham Forest being third in the table, seems like Wolves have, I guess, played respectably under the new tenure of the new manager. So that's kind of the picture of the game week. From a clean sheet point of view, I'm obviously invested into the Arsenal defense. I'm invested into the Liverpool defense. I'm also invested into Crystal Palace, Newcastle, and Fulham. And it's just such a clear fixture for me to go for the Fulham defender in this case. I'm hoping, of course, that Hull loses a clean sheet so I don't look stupid once again. And then, of course, Munoz, who's been extremely attacking, doesn't really have too many chances of keeping a clean sheet versus a Chelsea team that, for the most part, is still a very lethal offense, although they did not score versus Ipswich. They still created enough chances. And I think that that's sort of what we can rest on for Chelsea for the most of the season. Definitely attack tilted, pretty weak on defense, have gotten potentially weaker on defense, but that's, I think, just an overall point about how they've not really performed really well recently. And that's it for our sort of usual summary of Rob T's graphics and sort of a good context of where the markets are at with their predictions. As I say, always have a look at 11FI's predictions as well, because they're very, very helpful in terms of contextualizing what the differences might be between a team strength model and the market almost, and what their expectations are. So jumping into my team, of course, I spoke about my defense. It's quite clear what I'm going to play. I'll be playing Gabriel, Trent, and Castagna. 3 home games there. I'll be playing Flecken as well. Flecken, I wouldn't even say it's the banker at this point. It's an away game versus Southampton, who look like they have some life around them recently under Ivan Juric, and so I am expecting Flecken to lose a clean sheet. I am still absolutely gutted about Flecken losing the clean sheet versus Brighton, but what can you do sometimes in FPL, right? Last week we had the Cunha injury, and then the week before that we had the Flecken injury, and it's just not helped at all. Hopefully Castagna, Trent, and Gabriel will do me well. Every week that I own Gabriel, I think I'm not really hoping for an Arsenal clean sheet. In fact, I'm sort of watching the games hoping that he gets the header, which he always seems to get one chance per game for, but then it's the clean sheets losses that actually make me a bit happy, because everyone does own more than on average one Arsenal defender. So that's something to think about when you're looking at effective ownership, thinking about what outcomes you want to be hoping for. I think it's totally logical to still, for me, to play Gabriel, because of course at the end of the day, it's still trying to maximize points, right? Gabriel's a very good player. And in the midfield, moving on to that, I've got Odegaard, Palmer, Salah, and Mbeumo. Yes, Odegaard has been pretty dull recently, but I'm just going to play him reluctantly because Rodgers is suspended. I don't really have a plan to sell Rodgers, but really when I look at my midfield, I think Odegaard, Mbeumo, and Rodgers are all up for the table as discussions for, you know, when to transfer these players out. I do think 21 is still a good window to sell Mbeumo, and this is straight after he scored versus the best defense in town versus Arsenal, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But Palmer and Salah are just staying forever. Very obvious Salah captaincy. I'm not even going to dedicate a segment to that. Last week I thought it was a lot closer. This week you've got Palmer with an away fixture, and Salah has the premium fixture, the best fixture, and is the best player. And then in the forward lines, I'll be playing João Pedro, Wood, and Isak. Wood being a new transfer for the team. He's now versus Wolves away. Wolves still actually shipped a lot of expected goals conceded versus Tottenham, so I'm not expecting that suddenly their defense is, you know, waterproof. But Nottingham Forest have always been a little bit more of a blunt offense this season. So I'm still hoping for something from Wood just on the basis that it's a good fixture, but I'm not expecting for it to be an amazing game. The amazing game for Wood really comes in 2 weeks' time when he plays Southampton at home. And Isak and João Pedro, when it comes to these players, what I would say is with Isak, it's an interesting thing where a lot of people want to be doubled up or tripled up on Newcastle because they just look so good. And I'm sure that this is a great opportunity for me to go for Gordon as well, but I'm not going to do it for a hit. And still, I'd say Tottenham have been very poor on defense. So I completely understand people wanting to go for Gordon. It just looks like a great entry point once again back into more Newcastle. As far as João Pedro, a reluctant play here, but just such a good pick, right? We've seen a lot of 5.x type of players not play sufficient minutes. We've seen the midfielders as well. They have great minutes, but not necessarily the sort of intangibles like a penalty, like the penalties, for example, that João Pedro has. And obviously his underlying stats have dropped off quite a fair bit recently, but he still plays sufficient minutes and he still is actually getting some decent underlying stats for a 90-minute player. And I think you just have to sort of say, contextualize that as a for a 90-minute player. A lot of players have really good underlying stats, but you can't even guarantee that they necessarily play 90 minutes a game. And there is always the intrinsic value, as I said, of penalties. So that's going to be the team, the lineup. And I think going back to the point on Mbeumo, because a lot of people will find it interesting. Yes, I still probably plan on selling someone like Mbeumo, because if I keep Rodgers for the foreseeable, the way I see it is a lot of people are going to be planning for a wild card 30, 31, that sort of landscape. And when you look at the Brentford fixtures around that point in time, they're not amazing, right? 30 plus is a pretty poor game week or window really for this Brentford team. So whilst they have amazing fixtures on 24, on 25, on 26 and 27, and even arguably 28, that 5 game week pack of games still does reflect that there are poor fixtures around them, right? Like Liverpool, Crystal Palace, 22-23. And then after that Aston Villa at home game, you've got Bournemouth on 29, Newcastle, Chelsea, Arsenal, Brighton, Nottingham Forest as a pack of games really after that. So there still is over the entire landscape of Mbeumo. If we forecast many game weeks ahead, there are still a lot of poor fixtures, and the home fixtures are still versus tougher teams. Yes, of course, he scored versus Arsenal, but I probably have to discredit Raya, who's been having an amazing season so far, and say that he probably made a mistake, right? Ultimately, from that chance, he kind of just left his near post empty, and I think even Calafiori was also dummied by Mbeumo. So arguably, it's also just a good instance of a striker or a forward showing his instincts. And Mbeumo, as I've explained over the Cheat Sheet series, over some of the videos as well, he's been one of the top finishers this season. So has other players within years past. Maddison this season is another great overperformer, but you can't always guarantee that level of consistency. And I think you can still expect worse outcomes with worse fixtures. And that's simply the story of Brentford this season, right? If you look at all the home games that they've played, they were versus much easier teams and they're at home versus, let's say, Mbeumo away with much tougher fixtures and tougher outcomes. So I'm still expecting Mbeumo to be someone who is fantastic as a long-term hold. I've enjoyed another, I guess, increasing of my bank value through Mbeumo with the most recent price rise to 7.7, but I can still see him as a transfer out on game week 21 or at least on 22 when he faces off versus Liverpool, because Man City at home, honestly, is a great game, and I'm not going to deny that. And as far as Odegaard, he seems like a similar solution, right? You have to, I would probably give Odegaard game week 21 versus Tottenham at home, but then after that, it's a question of, is he really someone that I really want to be invested into long term? And if not, then I can just move on to someone else. And I think what would be nicer too is when we get some of these cup outcomes over the next few game weeks, I make these decisions on these midfielders based on trying to lock in a chip strategy. And I will be making a chip strategy video after game week 20 and after those cup matches have been made, because that is the time where we can actually talk about chip strategy. We know what the blank game week 29 will be. We probably will know when the double will fall. And that is when we can make some decisions around game week 22, 23, 24 and kind of understand what is our path going forward. So this is going to be the team selection for this game week. A little bit of a transfer plan type of team selection, because I think it's quite a standard, simple team selection. But in terms of considerations for this week, I think probably one of the questions that I've been asked a lot is, why am I playing João Pedro over Hall or over Munoz? And ultimately, I think when you look back at, let's say, Rob T's sheet, it's actually a very helpful illustration of why I've still done this, right? The clean sheet odds this week are very low for Newcastle and also for, let's say, Munoz, who's against Chelsea, who, of course, there's an away and a home gap here. But even if I think about, let's say, the United fixture for Newcastle, yes, there were low clean sheet odds there. Hall still kept a clean sheet. But I think if I probably have to give a little bit of credit to Tottenham, they still look like a better offense than United, in my personal opinion. If you look at, for example, any of their recent games, I think where you can fault Tottenham as a team is really being a relegation level defense right now, as opposed to their attack dropping off in any way. So if there's anything that's really dropped off from Tottenham and them suffering so many injuries, it's really the defense. I don't think the attack has lost too much of its edge, although you can argue that some of the players and their baselines have dropped, like Solanke as well. So I would still think that this is a good week to play João Pedro. Once again, I don't own more than one Arsenal defender, so I'm not emotionally invested, or my team is not even invested from an outcomes point of view, to hoping that Arsenal lose their clean sheet. And I'm still keeping Gabriel because he is a huge menace in terms of goal threat compared to, let's say, even the likes of a Munoz or a Hall. So quite comfortable in a game week where, let's say, if I chalk it up to, if I think all these players can lose their clean sheets, I still think playing Gabriel is quite reasonable on any game week. And so that's why I'm going to be playing João Pedro, and Gabriel still, at the end of the day, has more clean sheet percentages. I think it's not helpful to really look at clean sheets as if they're binary, because the reason why odds are helpful is you're still trying to make the best case decision. For example, it's not 0 to 100% when someone scores a goal or braces or let's say is expected to assist. And so all these percentages we can kind of play towards our favor. I still believe that they actually help produce like good long-term outcomes for decision making. And that's why I'm playing João Pedro in a game week like this, where I'm not, as I said, emotionally invested to the Arsenal clean sheet, and he's still a very, very sort of top pick. And not to mention, when you're playing a Hull or a Munoz and they're playing versus elite offenses, I mean, the drawback always is going to be you can be conceding 2 goals, 3 goals, 4 goals even, right, in a ridiculous outcome. And that's going to be negative, whereas João Pedro is sort of safe from that sort of outcome as well. So that's going to be the team selection. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and I'll see you guys soon for more content.